Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about global trade issues from the United States point of view. Just to introduce myself, I've been involved as an advisor to the United States government on trade issues, sorry to say, since 1980, which dates me a lot more than I'd care to be dated, but that's the case. So I've been involved in this kind of stuff for a long time. If you want copies of these slides so you don't have to furiously write or take pictures, if you give me a card after the show or after the discussion, I'll be glad to do that. Just more on me. Okay, international topics to be addressed today. What I'm going to try to do is look ahead. And when this slide was written, it was the Democratic trade agenda because we didn't know who the Democratic nominee was going to be. We do now. Kamala Harris. Trump administration's second-term trade agenda, the so-called IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which has been the cornerstone of President Biden's outreach. Some discussions about what's going on with Taiwan, the U.S.-European Trade and Technology Council, a few other discussions that are going on. A slide on Russia, Ukraine, and things that you need to watch out for. A slide on the so-called BRICS. That's a trade group that's dominated by Russia, China, and Brazil. A couple of slides on China issues, and including their strengths in international trade, and they have done a wonderful job going around the world spreading the Chinese products. Slide on the 301 surtaxes, and I want to finish up with a discussion on 24D, because anybody that's talked to me over the last couple of days or the last couple of months knows that, in my opinion, that dumping case on 24D is a game changer. And whichever way it goes, it will be felt for years and years and years. If we talk about a likely Harris administration trade agenda, from everything I can see and read from all the insiders in Washington, they believe it will be a continuation of what the Biden administration has been doing to date, probably slightly more left. And as close to politics as I'm going to get today is the following statement. If you are a single issue voter, and that issue is climate change, you have two choices. If you believe that climate change is the biggest existential threat that this country faces, you need to vote for Kamala Harris. If you believe that that's incorrect, you need to vote for Donald Trump. The only place that I can see where those positions of the two candidates are the exact opposite end of the spectrum is this, climate change. So the Biden administration has been very strong on climate change and everything they've done in trade and also labor and other environmental issues, and very much believe that the traditional idea of free trade agreements has not been good, especially for underserved communities and minorities and small businesses. Never thought about tariff elimination, and the farmers that buy our stuff have been hurt by that because there's been no market opening for any of the grains and the corn and the soy oils and things that our farmers make and our customers make and do very well in the United States. But need to export around the world. There will be, again, a continued focus on climate change, which is in accordance really with the EU, even though the EU did go a little bit more rightward. The Greens in the European Parliament did not do real well in the last election. The powers that be in Europe are not significantly altering their policies. And to me, the canary in the coal mine, if you really want to watch what's going on here, is watch what happens with electric vehicles. They are the tip of the spear on international trade issues, especially since every place they are highly subsidized, so there's an awful lot of government money and subsidization of that industry. Being tough on China will not change. The only thing that's agreed on a bipartisan basis in Washington is we need to beat the hell out of China in every way we can, and that's we need to live with China for sure. And so the continued pressure on China from the United States is going to be there, and I'm going to further discuss what's going on with the 301 in a later slide. What will a Trump second-term trade agenda look like? If passed as prologue, He also agrees that the traditional definition of free trade is flawed. However, he would likely push for a program in the United States that's called Trade Promotion Authority. What's TPA? What TPA says is that if the Congress passes a law that says the administration needs to consider the following list of topics in any free trade agreement they try to address, and if they do that, when the agreement goes to Congress, they can say yes or they can say no. They can't play with the details. There is no country that will negotiate with the United States if they think they're negotiating with 535 negotiators, 100 senators, 435 representatives. Free TPA, as it's called, eliminates that. President Biden has made it abundantly clear he did not want Trade Promotion Authority because he was not going to do anything that impacted tariffs. Trump will probably do it differently than that. And the fact is that when Trump administration ended, there was a free trade agreement with the UK that was about that far from completion. There was one with Japan that was a little bit further away, but not much. And there was one with Kenya that was all but done. And the Biden administration abandoned all those agreements. I suspect that if Trump is reelected, he will renew all of that. He will play around likely with the USMCA rules of origin, but not likely impacting the chemical industry to impact the EVs, because China's made it quite plain they want to build plants in Mexico, and he's going to make it really difficult, as will President Harris, for Chinese companies to build cars, electric vehicles in Mexico and ship them north. And they're going to have to play around with the rules of origin in USMCA to do that. He's promoted a 10% across-the-board increase in import tariffs. When I wrote these slides, frankly, I thought that that was just a talking point, but he has said it so many times since that it's likely something he really wants to do. However, if you do a 10% across-the-board tariff, you sink Medicare. Because if you raise the price of medicines by that extent, Medicare will tank. So everything he did in the past avoided in any way possible increasing the cost of medicines, and I suspect they will do that again. He's also talked about removing China's most favored nation status. That would have some impact. Some of the non-MFN tariffs make the 301 tariffs, the 25%, look like a walk in the park. So we'll see if he does that. I don't know. U.S. auto industry is king, so that will be the same for both candidates. Climate change goals. He's said this 1,000 times too. He will end the EV mandates, so that the drill baby drill is not exactly the thing that climate change folks thinks is a good idea. And there's no doubt that he's going to do that. That will cause issues with our negotiations with the European Union and other places that are dominated by the climate change issue. So it will make for a much more rocky path for any trade negotiations that occur worldwide with the developed world. I want to talk a little bit about, if you've been reading any of these things, the so-called IPEF. This is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. There are a dozen or so countries that are involved in this. There is no market access component at all. In other words, there's no discussion of tariffs, supply chain resiliency, and there's a list of so-called pillars that are in that negotiation. There are very few words like shall in anything that's been written. There's a lot of mays and wills, but there's very few shalls. So that in the case of supply chain, it sets up committees of all of the member countries to talk about supply chain. And what they're trying to do, I don't know how you do it with a may, is make sure if there is another pandemic that countries can't block the exportation of products on their own free, without any reason. You got to use words like shall if you're going to do that, and they're not doing it. So, but again, no market access, which is important to understand. So, the one thing that could be good for industry especially this industry. There are discussions about making sure that any regulations are done based on sound science, and some harmonization of labels and testing and acceptance of testing in other places could actually come out of this that would be good. And the other piece of it that's really kind of weird, they are doing these as so-called executive agreements. In other words, President Biden is going to, as they finish pieces of it, the president will sign it and it will not go to Congress for approval, which means that if there is another president, be it Harris or Trump, if they don't like what's going on in a particular piece of it, they can go, whoops, I don't like that piece. Sign another executive order and it's gone, which is what happened with a lot of the Trump positions and the Obama positions before Trump. He reversed them. Biden reversed a lot of Trump's executive orders. So by not doing these as treaties, which require congressional approval, they make them easy to change. Brief discussion on Taiwan. Of course, any discussions between the United States and Taiwan enrage the Chinese. Basically, the same pillars that are involved in the IPEF are on the table with Taiwan. Some of it was very low-hanging fruit, and there was some agreement on some of the simpler parts of it. China was not happy. It was when this was done, Congress actually decided to pass a law enforcing the few sections that were done. And it's important to note that that one bullet, since the U.S. has a one-China policy, these agreements were actually executed under the U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. This act created the American Institute of Taiwan, which is a nonprofit institute headquartered in D.C. And the Taiwanese government has been supporting actions that were signed by that institute. So it really ticks off China that we're having these negotiations. There's investment parts, but there's all sorts of parts that are in this. There is a pressure from Congress to negotiate a full-fledged free trade agreement with Taiwan. It is likely that Trump could use this vehicle to do that. We'll have to wait and see what happens. U.S.-European Trade and Technology Councils focusing on climate-friendly trade policies. That's not going to go real well with the Trump administration. Critical minerals, and interestingly, when they talk about critical minerals, they're not actually talking about the metals themselves or the minerals themselves. They're talking about the processing of the minerals, because I'm sure you've all read and seen how difficult it is to open up a mine in the United States, and it's even harder to open up one in Europe. Investments in clean technology is important on both sides of the Atlantic. They are talking about mutual ways to try to discipline some of the Chinese trading practices that are at issue, including state-owned enterprises, and the way China has worked to dominate certain industries, including EVs. Part of the reason the European Union is really interested in what's going on in this sector is we all know about the Biden administration has done all sorts of support for electric vehicles and other environmentally sound technologies that are only open to international trading partners that have free trade agreements with the United States, which the EU does not have. And so Europe wants to make sure that they can get access to those credits so they can sell a couple of Mercedes and other things and people can get the money. Trump could use this to achieve other goals, but my suspicion is that when he backs away from the global warming commitments, dealing with the European Union will be very difficult for him. Conversely, if Kamala Harris embraces the global warming issue with a broader attempt at it, then President Biden, that part of it will get easier. Other discussions that are currently going on. There is no market opening in any of these. Brazil, there's an economic cooperation. Discussions continue, and that's partially because, as many of you know, Brazil and China signed a free trade agreement a couple of years ago, and one of the benefits of that agreement for Brazil is the currency is yuan. So that if Brazil wants to sell stuff into China or China wants to sell stuff in Brazil, they no longer have to do it by converting into dollars. which I'm sure the bankers of this world hate, but it saves a lot of money and makes the transactions a lot easier to do. In Kenya, Kenya is the beachhead into Africa, and this is a way to try to go against, or really to compete with the China's Belt and Road Initiative, so that there's similar to the IPEF discussions as Kenya. Critical minerals, again, variety of countries, but more focused on processing, not actual mining. There's the U.S.-India Trade Policy Forum. It's looking to overcome the myriad of issues that exist between the U.S. and India for what we consider fair trade and fair importation into India of U.S. goods. India is playing hardball. You can't blame them. They've basically said, if you give us GSP, we'll be a lot more malleable in discussing the other things you want to talk about, because that gives them duty-free access on a fair number of products. And if you take organic chemicals, which are all traded in Chapter 29, if you can spell 2,4-D dicamba and glufosinate, you are looking at about a third to 40% of the benefit, duty-free benefit, that India would gain from GSP reauthorization. There's in the USMCA, there's discussion on labor issues. As you know, the Biden administration has been heavily pushing labor issues with the Mexico. GMO corn and glyphosate bans have been lifted. The glyphosate ban had a line in it that said, if there is an alternative. And the Mexicans, I guess, got convinced that there was no alternative to glyphosate. And on GMO corn, it's still not going to be in tacos, but it can remain in animal feed. But that has, animal feed. But that has not been finalized yet. When the new Mexican president takes over, that will probably be they'll dot the I's and cross the T's. And the American Partnership for Economic Prosperity is looking at a variety of countries in the American, in our hemisphere, to try to do some things to counter Cuba and some of the other communist leading countries. Russia, Ukraine. The key bullet here is that from a U.S. point of view, there were very, very few products imported from either Russia or the Ukraine that have any real impact on our industry, for sure. If you happen to be in nuclear medicine, it was real important because a lot of the isotopes that are used in nuclear medicine are only available from Russia. So those guys have had some real issues. And the loss of permanent normal trade relations for Russia was therefore not a real big deal, because even in the case of fertilizers are traded in the tariff system in Chapter 31. There are no tariffs in the United States, and there are no the so-called Column 3, which is where the non-MFN countries are tariffed. There are no tariffs. Those are all tariff-free also. So it's not a big deal. I'm not in the fertilizer business. There are huge dumping margins on both Russia and Ukrainian fertilizers. None of that changed. The one thing we have to watch, so far, there is no indication that explosives from either China or India have turned up on the battlefield in Ukraine. If that happens, the United States will go after whatever chemical company produced those explosives, and there's a lot of nitrotoluene in some of those explosives, and nitrotoluene derivatives are the base for an awful lot of ag chemicals, so that those companies will be severely punished for participating in the Ukraine war. And the U.S. has gone after Chinese electronics suppliers that have been putting electronic equipment into the Russian military weaponry. So we got to be real careful that we watch that. And for the most part, Western companies have already pulled out of Russia. I believe Syngenta is still in Russia, but most of the other Western companies have pulled out of Russia. So we don't have a lot to lose from sales into Russia. We don't have a lot to lose from buying stuff from Russia. The other place there's been a huge impact, you may have noticed that BASF announced that they were shutting down some substantial plants in Ludwigshafen. That announcement came out 3 or 4 weeks ago. The stated reasons for that shutdown was energy. European energy costs have gone up, and they're going to remain up as long as this thing is happening. So if you're relying on sources of materials still from Europe, they're having a difficult time with energy. And the other reason BASF said that in print was regulatory stuff. BRICS. This is real important if for U.S. companies. It's a trading partnership that was started by Brazil, Russia, India, and China in 2009. It now includes South Africa, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. There are other countries that are being enticed to go into this, and part of the reason to do this is to destabilize the United States dollar as the international trade currency. And probably go to the yuan. So far that has not happened, but it is a significant rival to the so-called G7. There is a large development bank, which is part of the way that China's done the Belt and Road Initiative. So it covers 41% of the world's population and 24% of the world's GDP. And China is, of course, the dominant force in the BRICS, and it is seen as a real threat to the dollar. China's strengths. China has done a remarkable job in projecting trade strength around the world. They joined the WTO in December of 2001 as a developing country. Excuse me. China is still considered a developing country in the WTO, even though it's the second largest economy in the world. There is pressure for that to change, but so far the Chinese have fought it off and remained a developing country. That gives them an awful lot of strengths in WTO affairs. They made 17 free trade agreements with trade and investment partners, and also with trade and investment partnerships, and are negotiating and implementing 8 more FTAs, so that those are free trade agreements. So Chinese materials enter those countries, and there's a list on the slide, and as I say, this slide I will make available to anybody that wants it, so that those countries are dedicated to free trade with China. It's more than the United States has in the way of FTAs. There's a regional comprehensive economic partnership which has been signed by a variety of countries in the Asia-Pacific area, including Brunei, Australia, China, Indonesia, Japan, thank you, South Korea, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, and a few others. It's a very strong free trade agreement which gives China a great way to move materials in their hemisphere. And the Belt and Road Initiative also gives them a great access to many countries. The China 301, these are the so-called China tariffs, the 7.5% and 25%. Trump began imposing them in 2018 in 4 tranches. It was thought that one of the earliest things that President Biden would do when he took office is, Trump did it, I'm going to get rid of it. And he could have done it with a stroke of a pen. He did not obviously do that. On May 14th, they released the mandatory 4-year report on the 301 tariffs. When Congress created that law, they said that there had to be a 4-year review. And part of what happened here is interesting to note. The public comment period on the 301 tariffs ended in January, first week in January 2023. And there was lots of comments, but you would have thought by summer of last year there would have been comments, would have been completed, reviewed the comments, and they would have published a report. Didn't happen. They said it would then happen in the 3rd quarter. Didn't happen. 4th quarter. Didn't happen. 1st quarter 2024. Didn't happen. 2nd quarter 2024, it happens. Why? President Biden, in a campaign speech in Detroit, told the automakers he was going to increase the tariff on EVs to 100%. The vehicle for doing that is the 301 tariffs. Shortly after he walked off the stage, one of his attorneys must have said to him, Mr. President, the only way you can legally do that is if you release the 301 review report, because it's got to be done as part of that release. So it forced the report out. The There is the 100% tariff on electric vehicles is included in that. It's the actual implementation has been delayed. It should happen within the next couple of weeks, though. Interestingly, the core of President Trump's idea here was, as I said earlier, to avoid increasing the cost of health care. In the review of the tariffs, the Biden administration added tariffs on needles and syringes and rubber gloves, which will impact the cost of health care. And there's a couple of companies in the United States that manufacture those, the needles especially, that are not complete line manufacturers. They are really upset because they fill out their line with imported products, mainly from China. We were hoping that the new release would include an exceptions procedure so that you could go after them to remove the 25% on materials that were only available from China. That is not part of the deal. The only exceptions that are granted in the revised report are for the equipment required to make products that are global warming, the solar panels and things like that. There's a recognition that the United States does not produce that equipment, and if you want to increase the number of solar panels, they need to be able to import it. There is a note which is important to this industry. On page 44 of the report, I quote, in December 2022, President Xi stated that China, in quotes, must persist in agricultural science and technology, self-reliance, and accelerate the breakthroughs in critical core agricultural technology. There is a policy there to make sure China dominates technology, including agrochemicals. A lot of us that were watching things knew something was up because when USTR put in their budget request, there was two unnamed and really one of the closely held secrets in Washington. They had two consultants that were reviewing the exceptions, and the budget request said we're only going to have one, and we reduced the amount of money we're going to spend on it. So we pretty much knew that the idea of having exceptions was done. So, and then on the existing 301 exceptions, the report on those was released on May 24. Important to note, they declined to renew the exceptions on over 100 items, which includes paraquat, the formulated paraquat, with the stated reason that it was because nobody appeared to be doing anything to outsource those products from China. Frankly, you can prove that that was not exactly right because any of you that are involved in NBPT for enhanced fertilizers and things like that know that NBPT was extended and there was no other source of NBPT than China. Same thing with dicyandiamide, which goes into that industry. The balance of the exceptions, NBPT being one of them, were renewed for an additional year. Okay. Anybody that's seen me the last couple of days knows that I think this is a game changer, the 2,4-D dumping case. It took a tremendous amount of intestinal fortitude for Corteva to do this. Corteva prided themselves on the relationship between that company and farmers and ranchers, and they hoped it would survive this case. Based on the fact that if they don't win, it's hard to imagine that Midland, Michigan can continue to make 2,4-D. The prices of Chinese 2,4-D are so low. Corteva makes the 2,4-dichlorphenol in Texas. They ship it to Midland to finish that molecule, and then they make the choline salt and the other derivatives and the other formulated products in Midland and other places. That 2,4-D acid plant would have a very difficult time surviving if this does not work. The chart shows what the imports of 2,4-D have been during the term of the investigation. And part of what people need to do when you look at these things is put blinders on, because many of you know enough about 2,4-D to say, yeah, the price dropped in 50% in the last 2 years, but it basically put it back where it was 2 years earlier. That doesn't matter. When the ITC and the Department of Commerce look at dumping, they put blinders on and they look at the term of the investigation. U.S. dumping law, as is the case with Chinese dumping law and Indian dumping law. And China's got plenty of dumping cases against all sorts of countries around the world on all sorts of products, as does India. And as an aside, India's just filed dumping on Chinese glufosinate, so UPL can manage to keep their plant going in India. Greatly enhances the ability of the domestic producer is likely to win these cases. There will likely be no impact on imports from Colombia, and I'm going to talk about that more in the next slide. The countervailing duty margins are crucial, as they might offer a real window into what's going on. There is two pieces to a dumping case. There's so-called countervailing duties and dumping duties. The countervailing duties are an attempt to equalize subsidies. Those subsidies can include currency reductions, free land, help with your employee costs, tax relief, anything that you can imagine. And does the United States provide industrial subsidies? Absolutely they do. Everybody does. But what this will look at is individual product subsidies in both China and India that are believed to help depress the cost and make it possible for those products to be delivered to the United States in quotes at less than fair market value. That's the countervailing duty. The other piece of it is the dumping margins themselves. So they will look at the cost of manufacture and try to determine whether they're selling here less than they are in their home countries. If a company sells 2 drums, a 2,4-D in China for $8, just to pick a crazy number, and they sell 1,000 tons in the United States for $2, they are dumping because they're selling it in the United States for less than they're selling it for in China. Doesn't have to make sense. That's the way it is. Import surges. The next slide we'll talk about some of the dates, but basically if Corteva claims critical circumstances, they will be able to go back 90 days from when those duties are first proposed. Australia has dumping margins in place for 2,4-D already. I was not sure that the case would proceed, but on May 17th, the USITC voted to continue the case. There was some playing around a little bit with the definitions, which likely means that the profitability of the choline salt will be included in the costs. New Farm, Drexel, PBI, and Alba did an excellent job trying to reset the case to a point where they became U.S. producers to try to knock it out, but it did not work. There is the countervailing duties margins are supposed to be posted on September 3rd, and the dumping margins on September 10. The September 3rd is already a 75-day delay from when they were supposed to be posted. They could delay by 75 days. It's September 10th with a stroke of a pen. The fact that Corteva, and it was testified in great length, pulled back from the supply of acid to U.S. companies a couple of years earlier didn't look real good, but it is not germane to the case. You do not have to be able to supply the U.S. demand in order to do a dumping case. The Corn Board and just about every farm organization that you can think of has petitioned to block this. That also likely should not work. It might, but it shouldn't. And the last bullet here is really important. Even though the case covers 2,4-D acid salts, esters, or formulated product, if you manufacture those salts and esters in a country that has a free trade agreement with the United States that includes the chemical reaction rule, aka Colombia, which is what is happening now and has been happening, that product is made in Colombia, and so what they're doing is perfectly legitimate and will not likely be impacted by the dumping margins. And the same would be true for Mexico, Canada, Australia, Chile, Singapore, South Korea, Peru, DR, CAFTA, that have the chemical reaction rule. Thank you.